Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Can you hear me okay? Oh, I'm so delighted you're here. My name is Tim Hankewich, and I am Music Director of Orchestra, Iowa. I know so many of you already. Many of you are patrons of our orchestra. We have musicians of our orchestra here, which adds extra pressure on me. That means I have to be factual and I have to be entertaining. But this is a really great year for us, as Orchestra Iowa and our preceding organization, the Cedar Rapids Symphony, is celebrating its 100th year anniversary. And it's big because if I do my math correctly, that happens about every 100 years or so. And so a lot of the discussions that have been going on formally and informally is both taking stock of our past, present, and future. What does that all mean? And I have to say that as I was preparing my remarks for you, I had a little bit of a difficult time organizing my thoughts in a way that doesn't meander. Because on one hand, when you're trying to take stock of past, present, and future, your past does inform your present, which does inform your future. So forgive me if I kind of jump around a little bit, because of the things that I'm about to tell you, especially about the future, has a lot of its roots of what's happening today, and yes, what's happened also in the past. So with that, I've also brought a lot of propaganda along with me that looks great as wallpaper. Most of it is the standard fare things like season brochures, which aren't as helpful now that half of our season has already been completed. We also have something that looks like this, which is about our 100th gala. Because before I get into my remarks, there's something that's rather unusual about our organization that I had a hard time wrapping my head around, and that was actually figuring out when our birthday was. Because the paperwork or the letters of incorporation, or however you say that, happened in 1921, but the very first concert happened in 1923. And for the life of me, I do not understand, nor do I know why 2 years had passed between the formal incorporation of the organization and its first program. But we did know that our first program happened in April of 1923. And we do have a gala performance featuring Connor Hannock, who I'm sure most of you know. He's from here, and he's now created such a great international career as a pianist. He'll be joining us as part of this event, as well as a wonderful violinist named Bella Christova, who I believe is really one of the leading violinists of her generation. But that's not a concert in and of itself. It's part of a larger gala fundraising event, of course, but it also marks our truly 100th anniversary. You'll also find propaganda that looks like this, which is truly a fundraiser, which is a raffle to help fund the orchestra. But really, what is most important, and you will see this, is this piece of paper about 2 of our next upcoming Masterworks programs. I'm happy to say that all 3 of our Masterworks programs now will be performed at Hansher Auditorium this year, which is a huge breakthrough for us, and it's also part of this discussion of past, present, and future. So starting in the past, it's highly unusual for an orchestra that turns 100 to have only had 5 music directors. Kitchen, I used to know this, Kitchen, Dennehy, Williams, T-Meyer, Hankewich. Each of us averaging roughly around 20 years in our tenures. And having a music director with long tenures is an advantage and a disadvantage. When you have long tenures, it gives an organization a lot of stability. And in my own tenure, I came here in 2006, we've survived a pandemic, we've survived a derecho, and we've survived a flood. And I'm only waiting for locusts and any other of the great biblical plagues. But in times of great crisis, a long tenure also helps the organization a great deal. The advantage of having a music director every 5 to 10 years, however, gives the organization freshness, more up-to-date in terms of best practices of how the industry is working and progressing, more up-to-date on who the young up-and-coming artists are. And that's also very helpful, because one of the things that we do at Orchestra Iowa, orchestras our size don't get the chance to rub shoulders with some of the truly international greats. They are just too expensive. Usually what we try to do is capture lightning in a bottle. And at Orchestra Iowa, we've had a really good track record of that. Violinists like Augustin Hankewich, who performed here and then had his New York debut the next week. Zlatimir Fong, a couple seasons ago, a cellist who literally won the Tchaikovsky competition the week after performing with us. Bela Hristova, who I've already mentioned. It's unusual for us and a very rare opportunity when we get to rub shoulders with truly the greats. Which brings me back to our present. Because our third and final concert at Hankewich Auditorium will feature the great Garrick Olson. A couple of years ago, you may have remembered that we worked with the great Emanuel Axe, which was one of the greatest weeks in my career and in my recent memory. And it's not very often you get to see somebody like that. And so to finish our season at Hankewich with truly one of the greats in Garrick Olson is going to be another dream come true. So I think in many ways the past it has been accentuated by certain crises throughout the year. I've already enumerated the many that I've had to oversee, but I think the biggest crisis for the orchestra happened, of course, in World War II. We were probably one of the only few orchestras that remained in operation during that time. But it's also something that has sort of defined our identity as an orchestra that perseveres through crises, and I've had to embrace that a great deal during my own tenure. But one of the things that's also amazing about Orchestra Iowa in its history is its relationship with its community. I think when you look at larger, more established orchestras in large metropolitan areas, there comes a time in the evolution of an orchestra in which the institution of the orchestra is eclipse that of the music director. And I'll give you an example. In this day and age, Riccardo Muti, one of the great conductors, living conductors, music director of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. He is a great conductor, but he is a steward of that institution. That institution is greater than the sum of its parts and greater than the personality of that person. Smaller orchestras sometimes rely more on a charismatic person, hopefully that would be me, to help inspire a community to support an orchestra. Because one of the most difficult things about running an orchestra is that each and every day you have to earn your relevancy. It's nowhere is it written in stone that a community is going to have a symphony orchestra. We have to make that commitment and we have to make that case to our constituencies every single day. And there are certain communities in this country that are, especially in the wake of the pandemic, are reassessing that, both in their philanthropic giving but also in their attendance. And there's a big sea change coming if it's not already here, which brings me to our future. Every symphony orchestra has a similar story into how it develops. certainly in this country. And it usually starts like this. It starts off with a handful of people, musicians, who want to get together and make music. And they get together and they say, isn't this fun? But you know, next week, why don't we do such and such a piece? Well, we don't have the music for that. Well, we need to buy that music. No problem, they pass the hat around. And next week they play a different piece, shall we say. And then they realize, well, this piece requires a harp. Does anybody know a harp? Harpist. Oh, well, I know somebody in, let's say, Independence. Well, okay, let's bring them in. Where can they stay? Oh, they can stay with me. Terrific. Well, we should probably also offer them some gas money. They live quite a ways away. And so all of a sudden they pass the hat around again. And then they realize, you know, for this Beethoven symphony, we're going to need violas. Does anybody know a violist around here? Well, I know somebody in Grinnell or somewhere. But anyway, as their ambitions grow, the needs of their organization start to grow. And they all of a sudden realize, wow, this is getting to be a really, really expensive hobby. So what do we need to do? Here's an idea, let's fundraise. And so all of a sudden you get your friends and your families involved in this and a lot of organization. And then finally you realize there's a lot of money going in and out and there's no one minding the store. And the next step is, well, you know, we need to have a board to oversee all of this. Okay, sure. So, and by the way, let's sell tickets as well, and let's do marketing, and let's do all this so we can put on a lovely concert. And then you realize, wait a second. For those of you who've been on volunteer boards, you realize that, oh my goodness, there's not enough hours in the day for us to do this. We need professional management. So you end up hiring a staff to do this, which means all of a sudden you have to sustain that. 40 years from now, it's when the population of the corridor area approaches roughly 600 to 700,000 people. Now, we're not even halfway there yet, but that's going to happen eventually. And it's that economic base that will drive the next step change in Orchestra Iowa's future, which is why in the aftermath of the flood of 2008, we changed our name from the Cedar Rapids Symphony to Orchestra Iowa, because the future is the corridor, this unit, rather than having two communities that are adjacent to each other. Eventually it's going to turn into one metropolitan area. The other thing about the future is, for Orchestra Iowa, Iowa City is the future. Hatcher is the future. In the aftermath of the flood of 2008, when we had no place to play, we knew then that we had about 5 months of flood sympathy. But we knew we had a 10-year problem. And in fact, our future, thinking 40 years ahead, was all based on our identity. Cedar Rapids is not a community that's large enough to sustain an orchestra on its own. And as we look for new audiences, Iowa City is critical to that. And Hatcher is critical to that. So after 15 years of developing an audience in Iowa City, we have a great home away from home in the Coralville Center for the Performing Arts. We are on the cusp of outgrowing that theater. I remember when we were doing the numbers, because the biggest secret about the arts is we too are a business. We realized that if we could have 400 audience members, we could pay for the service of that extra concert. And it took 15 years for us to get there, and it happened for the first time last season. Coralville Center for the Performing Arts holds about 500 people. And so in our immediate future, one of the big challenges that we're going to see is what happens when we outgrow the Coralville Center for the Performing Arts. How are we going to manage our audiences? And what's the math like when we move over to Hampshire? And the math there is an audience of around 600 people to pay for that particular service if we were to break even in that. But my dream and my vision for the immediate future is to develop an audience of roughly 600 or 700 patrons, which can only be housed by Hampshire, which is a spectacular hall, by the way, and our musicians adore playing there. Which, while I'm talking about now my conundrum of jumping from past, present, and future, which brings us back to this season which brings us back to this season, having all three of our final concerts being performed at Hampshire. A lot of people ask, Tim, what can we do to help? What can we do to help? And I think the one thing that is most powerful, that will make the most enduring, lasting assistance to the orchestra, is not only to attend our performances in Hampshire, but also to bring a friend and family there. Because once we get into the habit of playing in Hampshire, and that our audiences demand that we perform at Hampshire, then our audience will grow and sustain a large enough audience to warrant Hampshire. And so our immediate future looks like stronger ties to Iowa City, perhaps outgrowing the Coralville Center for the Performing Arts, and perhaps more performances at Hampshire. That's in immediate. That's in like the immediate future. And of course, 40 years, 50 years from now, the other view is making that transition from a per-service orchestra to a salaried orchestra. But what about the artistic trends? Times are changing, and orchestras need to change with it. I was really excited about our last concert that we did because it was a really neat mix between favorites and new music. What you're going to see going forward, and that's not just in Orchestra Iowa, but I think industry-wide, you are going to see a greater diversity in the kinds of music that orchestra plays and the soloists who perform them. You'll see more people of color. You'll see more and hear music of female voices, of people of all sorts of different cultures writing for orchestra. And the actual orchestra makeup is going to change as well. I already know that when we audition for open positions, just the makeup of people who are coming to audition for us, they look different than they did 15, 20 years ago. And that's a good thing. I think the only thing that I wouldn't say worried about, but it is a concern, is that there is sometimes pressure to throw the baby out with the bathwater. In that, we will always play Beethoven, and we will always play Brahms and Tchaikovsky. But how do you make room for new voices? And over the past 50 years, in my view, our industry has done a pretty terrible job at making people excited to hear new voices and new music. I remember when I first got here, I had an artistic committee that said, do not program anything written after 1950. Just don't do it. Don't do it. Well, that's hard if you're going to create the future. And if you are relying on more diverse audiences, more diverse artists, your repertoire that you need to be performing needs to be more diverse. But the key to that is inspiring a hunger from your audience to want to hear new voices. And so there's this constant constant tension of burnishing the old masterworks, but also presenting new music in a way that people aren't going to be afraid of. And I've been there. I've been in concerts where the new piece on the program had nothing to do with anything else that was being performed on there, and sounded like garbage falling down metal steps. And so people were going, I paid money for that, and that's 15 minutes I'll never get back. That does nothing to help the art. If you can find the right context for garbage falling down metal steps, then you can make a great case for it. But context is everything, and also trust between the orchestra and the audience is also critical, which is also an advantage if you have longer tenured music directors leading your orchestra, because it takes time to foster those relationships and trust. A lot of times people are scratching their heads, I don't know what Tim was thinking here. Really? And if I do my job right, hopefully they'll go back saying, I like the Beethoven, but that piece, that was cool. And that's a glimpse into the world that I live in. I would love to open up this to any questions that you might have, and any ideas that hopefully I would have maybe inspired from you. But in summary, the past and the future is basically one inevitable evolution from amateur to professional. And what does that look like? And that's either a per service, which we currently are, or it will be one day a salaried orchestra. And it also means what does music and what does it mean for a symphony orchestra to play? What is the music that we're going to play of the future? And it's going to be much more diverse, and it's going to be much more inclusive, and a lot more world music and all that sort of thing. But the challenge is for us who are in the trenches now is to harbor that hunger for it. And in our present, I think one of the trends that you've probably seen with Orchestra Iowa, and I think is that as, how did I say this? Let me back up. Let me give you an analogy of what my wife has been going through in the medical field. My wife is a pharmacist, and she was working in a hospital, and of course these past few years with COVID have been very difficult, and they've been overworked and very busy. But as we were engaged in the pandemic, a trend came to fruition, and that was societies are getting older, and there's fewer people to fill positions after them. So as COVID went away, the workload did not. All of a sudden, lots of people retired, and there was no new no new people coming in to fill those positions, and the medical field was being used as much, if not more, than before. So while we were looking at COVID, a much larger trend was already happening. Now, in music, what that means, what has happened now, what we've been talking about for decades, is the supply and demand of students being trained in conservatories. We are producing the best musicians ever now. But are there enough positions for that? And so what's happening in my world is when a position comes open now, there are fewer positions and a lot more musicians who want to fill that position now. And so one of the trends that's been happening is when I first got here, about 60% of the orchestra's musicians lived within a 30-mile radius of here, and 40 came from elsewhere. And over time, that has slowly changed to the point where about 60% of our orchestra now comes from out of town. Many of them from Chicago, some from Des Moines, some from Omaha, some from Kansas City. For a while we had a principal cellist that commuted all the way from Alabama. I mean, that's crazy. For very little monetary gain. And so as we continue in our progression, one day to a fully salaried orchestra, what you're going to see probably is more and more people from out of town coming here to play, which has its own unique personnel issues and logistical issues. Our principal bass lives in Nebraska, for example. That's hard to organize a quartet or a quintet with bass in his regard. So there are trends that are happening, and we do most of our auditioning locally. It's just that now more and more people from across the country are coming to audition. And so what ends up happening is that we have people who come in, they audition, and they stay here for maybe a year or two, have a good time, have hopefully a great musical experience, and then move on. And not being able to really have that base of musicians that will stay here for very long. That is a trend that I see is probably going to continue well into the future until the population base of this area can actually support a professional orchestra, so that somebody doesn't have to play in 4 different orchestras. Because commuting from Chicago, that's a young kid's job. That's what, you know, young kids who are really hungry to play. I mean, they're willing to do that. But after a while, it's like, you know, I think I'm going to just stay home, especially if it's an ice storm. So those are some of the trends that you'll see in the immediate future, if you haven't been seeing them already. So that is, in a nutshell, past, present, and the future, as much as I can see it. Any questions that you have of me, of what's happening this season, what's going on stage, anything that I've brought up that might have tweaked your imagination or your own thoughts? Yes?
Your last performance was outstanding.
Thank you.
To start with Slaughter on 10th Avenue and end with West Side Story was great.
Thank you.
However, I'm one of the old fogies
Yeah.
that loves Beethoven et al.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't like the stuff since 1950, like you said. However,
Yeah.
the young composer that you brought forth on that program was great.
Wonderful. So,
Good.
thank you so much.
I got a dumb question.
No.
The Harlem Quartet
Yes.
was excellent as well. Would you tell me, were there 2 violins or 2 violas?
Oh, that's a great question. So, 2 violins. So, those of you who are at the concert, you're the audience. This is the stage. We had 2 violins, a cello here, and a viola. And because the viola was on the side, you really couldn't tell. Because I mean, a viola is bigger than a violin, but not that much. And so when it's separated by 10 feet or so, it's kind of hard to tell. You know, you sparked an idea from me. Here, you can't will something to be a masterwork. It either is or it isn't. And the arbiter of determining what a masterwork's is time. I mean, that is why we play Tchaikovsky. That is why we play Mozart, and we no longer play Dittersdorf or Louis Spohr. I mean, they were good composers during their time, but, you know, not as good as Beethoven, you know? And so, and it's that time that creates sort of a consensus. And I have this discussion with my own conducting colleagues about commissioning new works, because it's a huge risk. You spend a lot of money, the composer spends a lot of time, and you don't know what you have until it's too late. And I've had colleagues where they went, oh my God, what have I done? You know? And so selecting the composer is actually very critical. Not that that person is necessarily going to like pop out a masterwork, but to create something that you know people are going to enjoy. And Michael Gilbertson, who is a native of Dubuque, by the way, and he teaches at San Francisco Conservatory of Music. We played a work of his in 2010. Pardon me, a student work of his when he was still a student at Juilliard, and it was great. I mean, it was just really great. And so his name was always at the back of my mind. And so when we decided that, yes, as part of our 100th anniversary, we are going to commission people to write music for Orchestra Iowa, it was a fairly safe bet. But it gives me a lot of heartburn, though, which is why I rarely commission works. If I'm going to perform a new piece of music, I want to hear a recording of it first, usually, because then you know what you're going to get. Whereas commissioning a new work is a risky proposition, for sure. But I'm glad that you enjoyed that piece. And we got this great picture of our percussion section with the tree branch. This piece, by the way, had a percussion instrument literally called a tree branch, and I went to the local park and picked up dead branches with leaves on it because the piece was called Wind, and it was literally rattling this tree branch to create the sound of wind, it was beautiful to see, great to hear, and it was a great part of the piece. Yes.
Would it ever be possible for an orchestra the size of yours to have part of it salaried and part of it not salaried?
That's a great question. So you're already thinking of the future. She's asking, is it possible to have some of the musicians salaried, whereas other parts of the orchestra per service? That is part of the adolescent process, going from one to the next. When I first joined the Kansas City Symphony, they had a tiered contract where they had Tier A would play everything, Tier B would play most everything, and Tier C hardly anything. And during my tenure there, they unified the contract into one pay scale. But it is not unusual that happens during a transition. I have to tell you that transition from per service to full salary, it's one of the most challenging and painful transitions an orchestra goes through, because I was there when it happened. And I'm glad to say that that's going to be somebody else's charge long into the future. But that is going to be one of the challenges that this orchestra will eventually have to face. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree that the American program is wonderful.
Thank you.
But,
More. That's right. Yeah.
Years and years ago, I struggled with a piano position of slaughter on it down.
Yeah.
I have no recollection of what was happening.
Right.
And we had no program notes, except the QRs, which in our generation are very new. They're very cumbersome, and you usually read them after the fact. And I think that's the wrong way to do it.
Yeah.
For a couple of practical suggestions, if there should be program notes, and by the way, the program notes, when I did get a copy of them, were abysmal.
Mm.
There were a series of declarative sentences that a freshman rhetoric student couldn't have gotten away with. Juilliard is misspelled.
Oh dear. Yes.
And so forth. That program notes, well written, could be made available online. People almost always buy their tickets online now, and they can get the program notes and download it, because you really need to read them beforehand, not when there's just 5 minutes before the concert starts.
No, please, because you were not alone in those concerns. What I find here's what's ironic, because like any organization, everybody trying to find a way to cut costs, and printed materials, paper's getting more expensive, and all that sort of stuff. I totally understood. Here's what I found that was really interesting, a part of the debate going behind the scenes, is here we are always railing on audiences to turn their phones off, and now we're asking them to turn them on. And it's kind of a mixed message, isn't it? And it also has, we've also heard from some of our donors who aren't getting concrete space on a page now as well. So it's interesting. I think the jury is still out about whether that's going to be the case going forward, because you make a point that a lot of people have expressed dissatisfaction with.
The opera is terrible in that regard too, because sometimes we did.
Uh,
Not having any notes for that was.
What, you don't speak Italian? Yeah, well, I mean, that's I can't speak for the opera, because we are just the hired orchestra for that.
You have to say that that core business comes from the Paramount makes the decisions about that.
You know, that's not, that also is a point that I didn't communicate. Some people assume that the Paramount where we play in Cedar Rapids is Orchestra Iowa's building, and it's not. It is a city-run venue, and some of those decisions are decisions that we have very little control over. For example, the opera, they wouldn't have had that opportunity. And a lot of ticketing, Orchestra Iowa does the ticketing for the Paramount. So whether you are a fan of opera, ballet, symphony orchestra, or monster truck, it goes through the same system. And one of the things that I found very frustrating running our organization is a lot of people, when they come to a production, they want a nice cocktail or a nice hors d'oeuvre, and sometimes, well, not sometimes, in the case of the Paramount, it is also being catered by the same people who are catering the local ice arena, and so I don't want to be disparaging, because it's a city building, and there is a place for a well-placed hot dog. Just not at a symphony concert, you know. And I remember we had such frustrations with people who wanted something better, and we couldn't offer that because of the contracting that went into the building. Who would have thought? We're talking hot dogs and catering in a symphony history presentation, but I got to tell you, it's part of the experience and it's part of the business model. There was a question back there. Yeah.
Yes, I'm happy to see that you will be performing in Hampshire, and I'll be there with my friends. And but I wonder how you view the Hampshire performance schedule. Is that in competition for the musical dollars or donations, or is it an ally you work with, or how does it work?
Oh, that's a good point. You know, I wouldn't characterize it as either. I'll tell you what happens is when you're putting a season together, it's not just about what you're going to play, it's about when you're going to play. One of the advantages we have with a special relationship with the Paramount is we have a first pick of dates. But by repeating performances in Iowa City, now we have to say, we go to Hampshire or the Coralville Center for the Performing Arts, what dates do you have available? And to align that so that the orchestra plays the same program back to back, rather than week after week. That is a very difficult nut to crunch, because Hampshire also has its own programming that it wants to present. And so that conversation happens as early, but right about now, February to March, because publication of seasons go out at the end of March, early April, and those are the conversations that are having now. Musically, there is no competition. You know, when they bring in the Chicago Symphony, hey, I'm going there, because you don't get a chance to hear unless you want to drive 5 hours. I mean, they are bringing in a qualitative, world-class ensemble. However, that doesn't mean what we do is any short shrift either. You know, I mean, we do not have the reputation of the Chicago Symphony, but we do pretty well Actually, we do more than well. We hit so far above our weight class that when we have guest artists come to perform with us, there's usually extremely low expectation when they come here. And the first thing they say is, "Oh, really? What's this orchestra doing here?" I mean, they always go away very pleasantly surprised because we so over-deliver in their expectations. I wish that was something that audiences generally would understand, that what we have in this area is very fragile, very difficult to sustain, but it is not only on par with our peers, but I'm telling you, I've guest conducted across this country with orchestras of similar and larger budgets than this. And not only do we do well, in most cases we do better. Yes? Oh, yeah.
I want to take you in a slightly different direction.
Sure.
After World War II, musicians were in pretty tough straits.
Yes.
And the New York Union, Cecil Reed, had a wonderful idea. And he said, one of the things that threatens to kill us is recorded music. So they formed what was called the Music Performance Trust Fund, which provided funds for small orchestras, in my case, a very small orchestra of a very small town, to be able to pay their musicians for a concert season. And my real question is not about that, but rather, what kinds of institutions are there that perhaps you didn't think you had time to mention that really are helping out in large and small ways these days, from private foundations to competitive arts council grants,
Right.
and so on and so on.
Right.
And I'm just, if you'd fill in a little bit of that, I'd be really interested, because it seems to me they must be important in some way.
Absolutely. You might have to remind me of the question, because I'm about to take a tangent with the aim of coming back. Because
what are the institutions that you didn't get to mention that can help out building the funds?
Well, recently it was FEMA.
Pardon?
Recently it was FEMA. And I'm sort of saying this jokingly, but in the pandemic, this was probably the first year nationwide that the arts were actually supported by government agencies beyond the National Endowment for the Arts. And I think the vast majority of artistic nonprofits that are in still operation today owe their existence to Triple P, whatever it was called, and shuttered venue grants. And so that's an unusual. That is a very unusual animal. What has happened over time is that the National Endowment for the Arts has sort of eclipsed all other sort of smaller national foundations that were geared towards that. And of course, each state has their own art supporting entities that aren't that great, to be honest. The United States has a culture of being more privatized than anything. I'm originally from Canada, and I'll tell you the difference between the two countries, just in terms of budgeting. So in America, 25% of our annual budget comes from tickets. The rest, maybe 5% come from state and federal grants, and the rest is purely private. Private foundations, individual philanthropy, corporate sponsorship. In Canada, it's 25% comes from ticketing, 40% comes from government entities, 40 to 45% comes from government entities, and the rest comes from private enterprise. And then you go to Europe, and you get 20%, 25% from tickets, and 75% from government entities. I can tell you, I really miss having that governmental chunk in there, because that certainly makes life a little bit easier. What has happened, and this is another trend going on in the future, is that corporations, what has and it's happened in a couple of communities, as headquarters move away, they are less engaged with their communities, and their philanthropic decisions are usually just sort of spread evenly. There once was a time where I could actually call up a CEO of a fair amount of companies and talk to them directly. Now those headquarters are in Boston or Chicago or somewhere else. And so as headquarters move away, community stewardship tends to lag a little bit. But the other thing is now industries are targeting their philanthropic dollar. For example, if you are an aerospace company, they are now directing their giving to STEM educational programs, and that has hit us hard. And so a lot of people are now, instead of giving to the medical profession or to the arts in general, now they are actually targeting specific areas that are more relevant to their particular industry, which leaves the symphony orchestra kind of out in the cold a little bit. And so to be very broad, there's less government foundations out there, and the private foundations that are there are now becoming more and more targeted. And that's sort of the trend that we're seeing, and that will likely continue.
There's one other noun that you mentioned in the middle of your talk that you haven't mentioned now, and that is unions.
Yeah. I think that is a trend you're going to see. Actually, outside of music, I think you're seeing a reinvigoration of unions in the workforce and the workplace. And I think that's, they are there to ensure quality of workspace and fair wages, and I have, I do not, I don't begrudge anybody the right to organize. You said something about recording, which I found very interesting, but there is a failure of imagination nationally when it came to recording. When COVID happened and orchestras were basically sequestered to doing something online, and which wasn't very successful, all these orchestras across the country had archives of material and content that they could have easily put online, even for a trickle of income. And yet, national agreements got in the way of that. And so at the time of our darkest hour of need, we were unable to do it. Not just we, we as an industry throughout North America weren't able to respond. And that's sad.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just as a practical matter, most people probably know this, but the Okino bus or van will gladly take you to Hampshire or CCPA to see the orchestra live or performances, and they'll bring you home.
Yeah. So, with that, let me follow up with a plug. Back to our presents. So our next performance in Hampshire is March 10th. It's Friday night, and it's the Verdi Requiem. Now, for those of you who don't know the Verdi Requiem, it is probably the biggest spectacle that we can actually put on stage in the standard repertoire. So in your mind's eye, think of 140 choristers and 80 musicians on stage, plus extra brass screaming at each other in the auditorium back and forth. For those of you who've never heard this piece, I guarantee you'll be walking out the door, tripping over your jaw, because it's just so delightfully melodramatic and over the top. For those of you who are opera fans, it's written by Verdi, one of the great opera composers of all time, and we have 4 soloists who have graced the stage of the Met. So I have high expectations of them. This is what they do. Also chose the piece because it's part of the Lenten season, and of course, having the Requiem liturgy is actually is central to the Catholic faith, but this piece, many of you might not know, this also has a much larger ecumenical appeal across religions, especially to the Jewish diaspora. because of its fairly recent performance history. The Verdi Requiem was performed countless times during World War II in the concentration camp of Terezin. And Terezin was imprisoned artists and was used in an extraordinarily perverse way to put a smiley face to the world, to show the world that nothing untoward was going on behind these prison walls. And this piece was a way to get beyond the Nazi censors, because it is a work of salvation. It is a work of pleading for mercy, and it was a message to the outside world of what was going on. It was a message that sadly the world order did not recognize or did not respond to. Thank you. But this power of this music, even though it is a Catholic text, whether it's between supplicant and God or supplicant to the outside world, it is a piece of extreme power in terms of volume and spectacle, but also in substance and its history. This is an important program, and I urge you all to come, because it is special. It is very special. So that's our next concert. So hope to see you there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being so kind. We'll see you at future concerts.